Hey, Gail.
Last time I was like a minute or two late, right? That's when it started. I was the first one to come in, so he's just talking to online. I'm like, oh, I don't want to do that again.
Well, it depends on how my evening goes, and so surprisingly, oh my gosh, I had
Right.
a granddaughter, right? Oh my goodness.
I'm 7.
So, I don't always think so. Little guy.
Is this your first?
Yeah, this is two now. Yeah, I only see down in Florida.
Oh.
Her little one is going to be turning 1 in June, and he's already almost in 12-month clothing.
Which is funny, because that's how, which, oh, these are both of them.
This is Wyatt, and that's Denver.
I should see this picture too.
Yes. Guys, and Tucker is almost in 12-month clothing, and he is probably about 9. He's probably about almost 9 months. He's pushing 12-month clothing. He's going to
Really?
be after his dad.
Which is so funny, because Courtney's daughter is right in that 2T. Now, the top will do a 3T just to have room. but
Yeah.
it's The 2T right on the nose. So people always tend to buy bigger. 'cause
Right.
they go-
Well, it's better than smaller because it can always grow into it, I guess, right?
Right.
Well, good. Well, it's 7, so we want to get started. Now, those that might still come can come, but it makes sense that we get going when we're going to start and try and end around when we're going to end. Sorry about last week, canceling. I knew the snow, and they were calling for it to be pretty bad, and it was in the morning, but then it all stopped. So I'm thinking I should have waited longer. I should know better, but I got a call or two about, are you going to be doing it? I guess I got a call. So I just ended up canceling. But that's okay. We're just going to kind of push things up a little bit. And so today we're going to cover the Gospel of Mark. Now, 2 weeks ago, we did do some conversation about the whole of the Gospels and how they're put together. And I don't want to revisit that too much, except to say we're beginning with Mark as opposed to Matthew, which would be the order, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John. We're beginning with Mark because, as we talked about last time, I think perhaps the strongest evidence is that Mark is the first of the Gospels. Not only does that make sense literarily, in my mind at least, as Mark is the briefest of the Gospels, and as the general structure and order of Mark is utilized in both Matthew and Luke. And if Mark came from Matthew or Luke, or was looking at those as a resource, it would have meant that Mark chopped out a lot of things. And that just doesn't seem to make quite as much common sense, basically. But also, some of the earlier references of history really talk about Mark in letters were written about 120 after Christ, talked about the origin of Mark being a sort of a kind of a secretary for Peter, who took down notes from Peter before he was killed. So, that would seem to therefore kind of reinforce this as being the first. So we're going to look at Mark first, and then we'll next week look at Matthew and Luke, which would be a lot, but we're just going to talk about some of the interesting, unique pieces of Matthew and Luke, and then we'll look at John, which is, of course, very different and not one of the synoptics or Gospels that are similar. So as we look at Mark, we'll because there is some similarity, we'll see a lot of these themes also in Matthew and Luke, but perhaps not quite as stark. Because I think Mark really, by its structure, by its outline, preaches in of itself. It teaches in of itself. Now, hopefully, as you came in, you were able to get one of those outlines. And I'll see about maybe emailing that so that people who are at home might get it. We also have some copies here you can get on Sunday, because that will be helpful for you a little bit. We'll talk about it. You don't need to see it, but I think this outline, as you look back, will help you remember some of the themes that we're talking about. So let's just get started with the Gospel of Mark. We're going to be reading a lot here as we move through, but I hope to have you notice some things. So the first chapter of Mark, I'd like us to begin, and it begins with the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Mark's Gospel begins very abruptly and telling us kind of what is going to be presented here. We have the good news, or the gospel. We talked about that last time, and the meaning of that. Really, that moniker is then what we've come to know all the Gospels as. I just use it, right? The good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And those two titles are important. Jesus, of course, the name of our Savior. Christ, which is really a title that for many of us, we almost use like a name, but it's really a title. It would mean anointed one in Greek. It's a lot similar to Messiah, but it would be the anointed one. So when we use that word Christ, it really in some ways is saying the anointed suffering servant. It's saying the anointed Messiah. It's saying the anointed king. So all of those things might be referenced in that. And then the Son of God, which we will see is a very significant recognition of the identity of Jesus. And it's one that I think it's very important for the gospel writer of Mark to have us recognize from the beginning, but have us learn throughout the Gospel of Mark what that means. That's a part of the hello. That's a part of it begins there with some titles that are going to continue to be lengthened and I'm going to say breathened, getting depth and breadth and length. So, here's the word breathened. All right, so let's just begin then looking. It begins written as the prophet Isaiah, "Behold, I send a messenger before your face who prepare your way, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight." I'm going to just read here a little bit through chapter 1, and then we'll talk about it. Try and listen for things that you notice like refrained and things that you might notice that are interesting that we cover. Verse 4. "John appeared, baptizing in the wilderness, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sin. And all the country of Judea and all Jerusalem were going out to him and were being baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Now John was clothed with camel's hair and wore a leather belt around his waist and ate locust and wild honey. And he preached, saying, After me comes he who is mightier than I, the strap of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." In those days Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open, and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased." The Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. Now after John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee, proclaiming the gospel of God, and saying, "The time is fulfilled in the kingdom of heaven, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel." Passing alongside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." And immediately he left their nets and followed him. And after going on a little further, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in their boat mending the nets, and immediately called them. And they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him. And they came into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. He cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent, come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him, and they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "Who is this? A new teaching? What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread throughout all of the surrounding region of Galilee. Now, I just read through verse 28. Chapter 1 still goes on for 45 verses. So I read just a little bit more than half. And you will note how far we already are. Right? Notice how quickly we get into the ministry of Jesus. In the first half of the first chapter, I've already been introduced to John the Baptist. We've already been introduced to his fundamental proclamation. We've already been introduced to the baptism of Jesus. We've already been introduced to Jesus' first proclamations. We've already been introduced to his calling of his first disciples. We've already been introduced to his healing of demons. We've already been introduced to the surrounding individuals questioning what this is, what kind of teaching is here, what kind of authority is here, what's going on. And it's an identity that the people don't know, and it's identity that the demons seem to know, or the unclean spirit seems to know. A lot going on there. Right? Now, how is that different than the other Gospels? Matthew, for 2 chapters, we have a genealogy, and we have all those wonderful stories we love about Joseph, and about the dream, and about the wise men coming, and the flight to Egypt, and coming back. And then we get started in the 3rd chapter with, the ministry of John the Baptist and Jesus. In Luke, we hear about John the Baptist very early, but for the first 2 chapters, rather lengthy chapters, we have the story of the birth of John the Baptist, and we have the story of the birth of Jesus, the Annunciation to Mary and the birth of Jesus. We have the story of prior to the birth, of course, Mary visiting Elizabeth, as Elizabeth was great with child, John's mother and Mary. We have a story of Anna in the temple and Simeon in the temple. So we have so much stuff in the first 2 chapters before, again, we get to the ministry of Jesus. And John, we'll see, is completely different. Mark gets us going right away. If you remember 2 weeks ago when I had that stole, and it kind of had symbols for each one. Remember, the stole for Mark is a lion. I think when you read this, you just get the idea of, we're not waiting around. This is a pounce. Jesus just moving into this world and breaking into this world in a fast way. And one evidence to that I would look to is, did you notice a word that I said a lot? Some of you have been studies with me in the past, maybe remember this from before, and maybe you didn't. It would be hard to pick up, but I tried to, after about the 3rd time, say it louder. But anyone have a guess? That's okay if not. The word is immediately, right? Immediately. In fact, in a lot of your translations, they'll soften it, because if you are, if this was a high school writing project, they'd say, find out a new word quickly. Right? They don't want to repeat it. Good translations of Scripture keep that word the same because it's intentional. Here, particularly in the beginning, one gets a sense of this was quick. Right? This was quick. Jesus did not waste time proclaiming this proclamation. And it has certain power and efficacy and immediacy to it that is utilized here. Immediately the disciples left their nets, right, and followed him. Immediately a man was there in the synagogue with an unclean spirit. All of these immediates are present there, so it's kind of very interesting. There's not much delay. I remember the story of a gentleman. The Gospel of Mark is shorter, and there have been those individuals who will memorize it word for word, and then will dramatically read it, which is a pretty neat experience to hear. And in fact, you can probably find a reading or 2 of that maybe on the internet. I haven't looked, but I'm sure that they're there. And this one gentleman was asked, what was the hardest piece of memorizing the Gospel of Mark, and then doing that? And he said, living with it. And part of what he meant by that, I think, was this sense of its immediacy and its power, and being called to a faithfulness so quickly to it, was something that challenged him. And when you knew it, and when you knew those words, and they became that much a part of you, he kind of had to live with that. Am I responding in the same kind of immediate way? So we have this really powerful sense of that. So, interesting. So if you look in your thing, we have, we've kind of gone through get ready and the movement begins, disciples are called. And I began reading in chapter 1, verse 21, where we begin to have this first miracle. And there's a couple of things that I just will have note. We'll note that the demons know who Jesus is. I know who you are. In fact, they say this, the Holy One of God. And Jesus tells them to be silent. Okay? So not only is this healing, there's this interesting dialogue that we have there. And I'm just going to hold on to that for a little bit. Also, I would just have you recognize that this miracle is noticed and that it begins to kind of get people talking. Now, what we'll have in the next few chapters, or next few verses through chapter 2:12, are 5 places where we're kind of told of miracles, right? And we'll see throughout this entire period of time how the crowds grow rapidly. So let's just look at that. If you have a Bible that kind of does paragraph type of things, you might notice some of these. In other words, when they have little kind of titles, those aren't part of the original text, of course. They're just kind of helpful things for us to find things in the midst of the text, kind of give us these little, paragraph helpers, I suppose. But after this unclean spirit, we have here, I have Jesus heals many, but a part of that is first Simon's mother-in-law, which is an interesting story, had fever. And then we have, through verse 32 to 39, kind of generically, the healing of many different people. In verse 40, we have the healing of a leper. And then in chapter 2, the first, I guess it's 12 verses or so of chapter 2, we have the healing of a paralytic. So there's 5 stories right away we have there of healing. And what we see throughout the midst of that is how things continue to grow. So in 128, we see Jesus begins at Capernaum and his fame begins to spread. In 133, find that, and the whole city was gathered at the front door, is what my translation says. In chapter 1, 38 and 39, Jesus has to say, then let us go on to the next town that I may preach there also, for that is why I came. And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. So he's moved from just being in Galilee, and there were so many people that, it was kind of crazy that they're going all over the place now. And then in 145, we hear, but he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the good news. This is the leper that was cleansed. So that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people are coming to him from every quarter. So by the end of chapter 1, I only read partway through because of just time constraints and wanting a chance to talk about it. We see by the end of chapter 1 already so many people are coming to see Jesus that he's not really able to get into the towns. It gets too crazy, too crowded. There's not enough room. They're causing traffic jams. I don't know what's happening exactly, but they have to be outside in the desolate places because it's easier. And they have a little bit of space. They can spread out. So very interesting. And that even begins, we see that continues a little bit as Jesus has to get out on a boat because there's too many people and those kind of things. So very interesting. So we have these 5 miracles that end with a controversy. And that controversy is in chapter 2 with the paralytic, and it's about the forgiveness of sins, right? And we'll see where they kind of questioning in their hearts in verse 8. Actually, go to verse 6. Now, some of the scribes, chapter 2. Verse 6. Now some of the scribes were sitting there questioning in their hearts, why does this man speak like this? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And immediately Jesus, perceiving in his spirit that they thus questioned within themselves, said to them, why do you question these things in your hearts? So Here, already at the end of these miracles, we have scribes and many others coming to see Jesus, but there's questioning, right? What's going on? This, he's blaspheming, in fact, is what they're thinking. So we then continue here, and we see we have now going to have 5 stories that are all controversies. Now, I'm including this one. It was a miracle, but now it becomes a controversy. He calls Levi, who is a tax collector, and there's controversy about that, right? Because he is eating with sinners and tax collectors in verse 16. We see there's controversy in verse 18, that John and the disciples. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" So more conflict or controversy. Then beginning in verse 23, we're introduced to another piece because they're plucking grain. Some of the disciples began to pluck grains of head. And in verse 24, the Pharisees say to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And then Jesus responds to that in the end with the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And then we have in chapter 3 a story of a man with a withered hand. But this is also a part of a controversy. This would be the last controversy that I'm talking about. So there were 5 controversies here that end in a miracle controversy. Just as there were 5 miracles that ended in a miracle controversy, now there are 5 controversies that end in a miracle controversy. So it's just an interesting pattern, isn't it? You have this story then, he enters the synagogue. A man was there, I'm going to read this whole thing, with a withered hand, and they watched Jesus to see whether or not they would heal him on the Sabbath, so they might accuse him. So they moved from questioning in their hearts to that they might accuse him, right? And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around them with anger, grieved at the hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. I said how quickly things move in Mark. We are here just into the 3rd chapter. And not only have crowds grown so large that Jesus can't be in the towns, but his opposition has grown so resolute that they're already speaking to the Herodians, which would be those connected to Herod, which Herod is, of course, the political puppet that has kind of police powers almost, one might imagine. Rome, of course, more important, Pilate, but he's kind of the puppet dictator that they allow to do their stuff. They are counseling with the Herodians how to destroy him. So very quickly we can see this escalating already in chapter 3. Someone said once that the Gospel of Mark, and you can almost say this about all the Gospels, is a passion narrative with an extended introduction. And we'll see how the Gospel of Mark particularly, I think more strongly, and not that the others don't, and each of them do in their own ways, but I think most starkly we'll see how Mark points us to the cross. And very early here we see that happening, right? That this power of Jesus breaking into the world is not going to be met just with open arms. Some arms are open, but there are also those forces that are going to oppose it. And we see both those things happening very early. Very quick, I would like to say it's a foreshadowing of what's to come, but it's almost more than a foreshadowing. It's a telling of what's coming, right? You know what's going on. Now, all of this is interesting I just want to step back a second, because normally how do we read this? And normally we read this, we have this verse, we have this verse, we have this verse in church, or even your devotionals are probably like that. If you were reading this like a novel, if you were reading this from the beginning, you would probably notice this. Man, this is moving fast. Okay, this is, almost too fast. You're like, can you slow us down? Can we hear a little bit more? And then the Gospels give us more. Right? Temptation in the wilderness, here is just out in the wilderness 40 days, and the angels, the wild animals are there, and the angels tend to him. Well, Matthew and Luke add a lot more to that, don't they? We know those details. So the Gospels say we need a little more meat to these bones. Right? But Mark isn't about that. He wants us to see where this is heading, and because that's the pinnacle, that's the point, that's the moment of salvation, and that's what he's come for. And Mark wants us to see that. Theoretically, Peter wanted us to see that. Okay? Great. My, oh my. Okay. We got to keep moving here. All right. So chapter 3 then continues really wonderfully, and it's so thematically as you move through. There's a flow to it that really is wonderful. And in this case, we have in chapter 7. I told you the crowds keep getting bigger and bigger. He's out in the wilderness. Well, here, in this case, he told the disciples to have a boat ready in verse 9 because of the crowd, lest they crush him. So there's so many people he had to get out kind of on the boat just to kind of be able to manage that, okay? By the way, in that same area in chapter 11, or in verse 11, I'm sorry, chapter 3, verse 11, and whenever the unclean spirit saw him, they fell down before him and cried, "You are the Son of God," and he strictly ordered them not to make him known. I just want to throw that out again. Remember before we had that? I'm going to skip a few places, but this is a common theme. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. We then have in verses 13 and following the 12 apostles lifted up. We then have a conversation in verse 22 through 29. Well, I should stop. Actually, in verse 13 through 19, the apostles. In 20 through 21, we have this strange text where family tends to gather. He went home, the crowd gathered, and when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they're saying he's out of his mind. Very strange, right? The family here is not even. So the 12 apostles are gathering before him. His own family here is not. We then have blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, right, which is kind of comes off of that same thing because the scribes come and say he's possessed by Beelzebub, by the prince of demons. He cast out demons, and there's conversation about that. So from the 12 apostles who are following him to his family who is not sure what's going on, to scribes and Pharisees who are blaspheming against this work of God happening. We then have verse 31 and following, the end of chapter 3, a return to the mother and brothers. And his mother and brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him, and the crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you." And he answered them, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and my sister and my mother." So this whole chapter is really about crowds coming, disciples coming, others not coming. Who defines family? This new family is defined by everyone who does the will of God, right? Who hears this word, who accepts it, who follows very early what the proclamation of John the Baptist and then Mark was, repent and believe the good news, and then live out of it. And then live out of it. Okay? So, that gets it to there. Again, we saw how those crowds gathered. There's this interesting piece that is through that chapter 4 that we kind of come to by the time now we get to chapter 5 in a kind of critical way. And that is, I guess actually we got to end of chapter 3. So chapter 4, we see here, just begin. Again, he began to teach beside the sea, and a very large crowd gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat on the sea, and the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. So, remember I've read before this, the crowd was so crazy, they were so jammed, he said, let's get into the boat. But here again, he begins to teach by the sea. So he gets into the boat. One can imagine that gives a little more perspective, right, and a little more space, and he can be heard, and people aren't coming to him while he's trying to teach. You can kind of manage that a little bit. And we have here in chapter 4 a series of parables. Okay, and all of those parables have to do in one way or another about the kingdom of God. It begins with the story of the sower, which we know well, the seed being cast out in different places, growing differently, about a lamp being under a basket, about the seed growing, and it does so kind of by God's work, not by our own, right? The parable of the mustard seed, how this large thing grows. So we have this whole teaching, and Jesus is saying, this word that I'm teaching, that the disciples just went out to teach, because remember the disciples were just gathered, this whole word is a word that is like the seed, and it's one to be shared, and it's one that will grow, but it will grow because God grows it. It's not your job. Some won't grow. Some will get choked out. But we need to let this light shine. All of these images, all of these teachings here at the sea are about this word and its growth. So just as we've seen that growth, we're now being taught about that growth. And we're being taught also that some of that growth is not going to happen, because sometimes the weeds come up and choke it out, or sometimes it's on rocky soil and it starts to grow and the sun burns it out. So we have all of these kind of teachings right after that. So it's really very interesting. And through this, we also will see, this is all like by the sea. So we move through, finally we're to the sea, now we're almost on the sea. And when we get to the end of the chapter, in chapter 4, verse 35, we'll see Jesus now crossing the sea. So he's gone and he's been teaching from the sea. But now he's on the sea and he's going to cross the sea. And of course, it is at this occasion where they're in the boat. This begins in verse 35. They're in the boat and Jesus is in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they're all concerned they're going to perish. They awake Jesus. Jesus rebukes the waves, peace be still. The wind cease. And Jesus says to them in verse 40, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they're filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and seas obey him?" Now, this begins a period, and you can look at your bulletin or your insert on page 2 of that. I have it listed, crossing the sea 3 times, including the Gentiles, bread for all. And this is a very interesting piece. And what we see here is up to this point, Jesus has been in Gentile territory. And now he's going to cross over. I'm sorry. I know what I'm thinking, but I don't always say it. Jesus is in Jewish territory, right? He's in Galilee. He's in his hometown. And now he's going to cross over the sea. And what he does, when he does that, and he gets into Gentile territory, right? And what we're going to have here is a period where Jesus is going to cross the sea back and forth 3 times. And I'd like to think about that as, if you imagine, this paper as being the sea, it's kind of stitching it together, right? It's also a sense that there's this chaos in between, this chasm between, right? The sea was viewed as being kind of chaos, right? That Jesus is spanning and connecting. And we'll see various ways that happens, both in these images of the sea being calmed, right? In the going back and forth in the sea being calmed. And we'll see that happens again in chapter 6, as Jesus goes back again to Gentile territory. He'll go to Gentile territory in this verse, then he returns in the beginning of, around the 20th chapter of 5, around 20, around verse 20, let's see, actually in 21, and then he crossed again to the boat to the other side, so then he gets back into more Jewish territory, and then he goes back in 6:45 to Gentile territory, and that's where he has to walk on the water. Actually, the disciples go ahead, right, go into the boat before him, and They go across, and then Jesus kind of follows them on the sea, right, and meets them, and again, they're afraid. And then he returns to Jewish territory and then back to Gentile territory. So back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, this trip 4 times. And in the midst of that, different things happen. So the first thing that happens is in 5:1. And this is the story of the Gerasene demoniac. So Jesus goes across the sea. He stills the waters of chaos. And what does he encounter on the other side? He encounters about as unclean, demonic, foreign, broken of a place and situation as you could imagine. Because here is a person who we've come to know as the Gerasene demoniac. Let me just read that a little bit for you. When they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when Jesus stepped out of the boat, immediately, there comes that word again, there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart and broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs, on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran, fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of this man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us into the pigs, let us enter there." So, you could not picture a more unclean place. There are so much possession there, so many unclean spirits there, so much evil there that they're known as Legion. A whole Roman cohort is there, right? And beyond that, you have this sense that he's in the graveyard. And, if you have any recollection of Levitical law, just being in a place of death, touching the dead, being around that makes one unclean. Beyond that, he would cut himself with his chains and beat himself. So he had blood, and touching that was unclean. And just even without all of those ceremonial uncleanness, you're in Gentile land, the land of the Gerasenes, you're where pigs are. Pigs are unclean, right? This is just all opposite of the land that you would expect the Messiah of Israel to be in. But here Jesus breaks into this land and cleanses this land, sends away this demon. So at the end, this person, in verse 19, Jesus did not permit him to follow him. This man kind of said, "Can I come with you?" But Jesus instead said, "Go home to your friends and tell him how much the Lord has done for you and how he has mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. So he goes to Decapolis. That doesn't sound like Jewish town, does it? Decapolis, 10 cities. He goes to the 10 cities and he proclaims that. It's interesting, he allows this man to go proclaim what has happened. Up to now, he's been silencing. In fact, he silenced these demons, who he was. But among the Gentiles, he didn't need that to be silenced necessarily. And we can talk more about that in a little bit. So, he crosses back. So, we have this powerful exorcism, right? Jesus crosses back to Jewish territory and goes through several healings. He is rejected in Nazareth. There are many interesting things even about these healings. I was reading this in preparation for the story, or for this time, just to, reread it all through. And I was looking at the story here in verse, I guess it's 24 of chapter 5. It's really a crossed over story because there's this person, Jairus, whose daughter is at the point of death. And then in the midst of him responding to Jairus, and this daughter dies, in the middle of that is this woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. And it's such an interesting story. So, but for 12 years, right? 12 is such an important number. How many disciples are there? 12. How many tribes of Israel were there? 12. So there's 12 years. And we'll see another 12 show up. So this woman had this suffering of illness, bleeding for 12 years. And Jesus heals this bleeding. So how did maybe this isn't where this text goes, and no doubt this story happened, and there's other significant pieces we can look at, but just follow with me a little bit. You know, how did the people of Israel heal their sins? How did those 12 tribes heal their sins through the generations past? Offering sacrifice, blood after blood after blood. No longer does this child of Israel, who'd been doing that 12 times, have to bleed. Who's going to bleed for her? Jesus' blood. Interesting double thing. So that might seem like a leap until you recognize that this is really this kind of going back and forth across the sea is to some degree, and there's a lot of those little things, but I hadn't really thought about that one until today, actually. So there's a lot of those little things that are present here when you recognize Jesus is kind of establishing this kingdom, this proclamation, his messiahship in both of these places and bring them together. And I think that's part of what we see here. So what we also see at the end of this time, where we begin with these two healings, and we have this woman of 12 years in the midst of that. At the end of this visit in Jewish territory, if we look to 6:30, I know I'm skipping some things. You have them on your outline and just kind of having us to see a little bit. We have the 12 being sent out. There's a lot of 12 in this, right? There's the 12 years. There's the 12 being sent out. And then we have the feeding of the 5,000, which you probably know well. There's all these people that have gathered, right? And, what are we going to do? What do we have? Well, we've got 5 loaves and 2 fish. He commands them to sit down. And in verse 42, we are told that after it was all divided among these 5 loaves and 2 fish, that all of them ate and were satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. So there's another 12. So what's this story? One, it's this miraculous feeding, and maybe it's just there. But we have here the whole people who are gathered have been satisfied in Jesus, in the bread of life. Gospel of John, very different. We'll talk at some length about I'm the bread of life, and that spiritual food who is Jesus who feeds us. And we need to partake of him, eat his blood, drink of his blood, eat of his flesh. Very sacramentally begins to talk about this. But here, we have this sense of there being 12 baskets overflowing. And one would have to think here again of the 12, right? This 12 has appeared on this side, this visit, 12, 12, 12. Beginning, end, middle, 12, 12, 12, right? There's the 12, there's a completeness. All the 12 tribes, there's enough for everyone in this, right? There's also going to be for the Gentiles. Now, sometimes we probably even forget this because we just think about the feedings, but immediately after this, Jesus crosses the sea. That's in verse 45 through 52. That's where disciples go ahead and he walks in the water and they're again afraid, but they come out. He heals the sick. He has some conversations about some of the tradition of the elders and how they kind of were, their lips are there, but their acts are not. Talks about what defiles a person. Now, why is all this important? Well, it's because of these traditional things that who's in and who's out, he's kind of breaking down here, right? And in the end, he kind of says, what defiles someone? Is it because of what you eat? What are we talking about there? In part, we're talking about Jewish kosher laws, right? To be a person of God, you're not eating the pigs, right? You're eating kosher meat. You're eating in a cleansed way. And in verse 14 and following, Jesus makes it clear it's not what goes in that makes one defiled. It's what comes out of the heart that makes one defiled. In verse 20, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. From within, out of the heart of a man comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. So get away from all of these traditions that you have, many of which you're kind of falsely doing anyway. You're holding on to the traditions as opposed to God's word. And furthermore, what defiles, what comes out of the heart. And your heart is not good. You can follow these things, but it's about what comes out of the heart. And these people can do that just as well as you can, right? We just talked about this text because we're looking at Matthew. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, if your hand causes you to sin, it's better to cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. And we immediately pointed to the same verse in Matthew, where the same sentiment is expressed, and that is that you can't cut off your arm and no longer sin, or your eye no longer sin. Nor is it about just doing these external righteousness pieces or this tradition. It's instead about a change of the heart, and that's what Jesus wants. So we don't need a cutting off of the eyes or hands, but we need a change of our heart. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. But Jesus is doing this and speaking about this in this other side, in territory that Gentiles were at. And as we come to the end of that period of time, chapter 8, a great crowd gathers. He has compassion on the crowd. They have nothing to eat. Right? His disciples, how are we going to feed these people in this desolate place? How many loaves do we have? They say 7. This is a little bit different, right? And giving thanks, he breaks them, sets them before the people and before the crowd, and they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them, and they ate and were satisfied. They took up the broken pieces, left over 7 baskets full, and there were about 4,000 people. So this is a second feeding. You might not even really realize it unless you read through their second feeding, because you might have just put them together and not caught the different numbers. Right? But how many are left here? 7 baskets full. There's 7 loaves to begin with and 7 baskets full. And 7 is a number for perfection. So, one way of looking at that potentially is that, now everyone, this is the number of perfection. Now all nations, all people are gathered. But fed here and fed there. Kind of very interesting, isn't it? Going back and forth, bringing this together, planting the kingdom in both sides. That whole piece goes through 8:14 through 21. Oh boy, we really got to hurry. All right, so that's crossing the sea and doing those things. And then let's get to what is, I think, it is the central part of the Gospel of Mark, literally, but also I think it's kind of brings forward the theme of Mark. And that is this text beginning on 8:22 and continuing in 10:52. Let's do this by looking first at, 8:27. So in 8:27, chapter 8, verse 27, Peter confesses Jesus is Christ. Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And he told them, John the Baptist, and they told him, John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. And then, in verse 31, he begins to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel's will save it. And continues there a little bit, significant words, but I'm going to stop there for now. So this is maybe if you had to pick the central verse of Mark, the pinnacle of Mark, the nexus point of Mark, the axis of Mark, this would be the text, I believe. Because this all comes to the question of who is this, right? And that kind of question has already been there. The people wondering, what is this new teaching? Who is this that calms the waves? Demons seem to know it. People don't immediately know it. Jesus says, who are people saying I am? There's a lot of answers. Not everyone knows it. But who do you say that I am? You who have been following me, you who have been with me, you have been seeing me and hearing me and listening. Who do you say that I am? And Peter makes this confession, you are the Christ. Now, there's an interesting piece to that, but we'll just leave it at that, okay? You are the Christ. Remember, that's one of the titles this began with. In other words, you're the anointed one. You're the one that God has established for this position, right? And then, so they finally have gotten it. They've finally gotten it. He's the Messiah, the anointed one, the chosen one, the new David, the new king. All the promise we did in the Old Testament that we were talking about looking ahead. You're the one. They figured that out. Now, what does Jesus say right after that? He strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Now, first of all, that's just kind of surprising probably to us, except we've seen that, haven't we? We've seen demons shut up when they know who he is, be quiet. Excuse me. We might have assumed that that's just because you shouldn't listen to anything a demon says, even if it has some truth, it's liable to be something that tries to be manipulated. And I think in this case, that's part of why Jesus silences it, because he doesn't want that manipulated, because that confession is completely true, but I will argue that the point is he doesn't want them to tell them anything say that, because they don't understand, nor does anyone else understand what that means. So it's one thing for them to say you are the Christ, you're the anointed one, you're the Messiah. It's another thing for them to realize the ramifications of being the Christ the Messiah. What is the typical ramification that one might think of if this is God's only Son, as the demons make clear, or even here, the confession of Peter, you are the Christ, you're the Messiah. The acknowledgement is you're the one with power, and we've seen that in his miracles. That's in part what's brought the people to this place. It's also brought opposition to him. But we've seen that power charging into evil and scattering it abroad like a lion among, gazelles or something, among pigs, I guess, really, if we take the story of the Garrison Boniac seriously, which we should, but, the lion, pigs anyway. So the point is that they don't know what that implies. And immediately after, Jesus begins to teach them what it means. Because Jesus says, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man, which is another name for the Messiah, and it's the way Jesus frequently talks about himself, the Son of Man. And what's interesting about that is, that title, which is a title for the Messiah, brings about the divinity. What did the demon say? I know who you are, you're the Holy One of God. What did the title say to Mark? The Son of God. But here, what is this? The Son of Man. In other words, yeah, Son of God, but you need to understand I'm also Son of Man. I'm taking humanity on in its fullness. And what is that going to mean? Suffering, rejection, death, and then a victory. That is what is critical to understand. Why shouldn't the disciples say anything? Because they're not ready to understand it, and no one else is either. In fact, we have the example here more clearly than any place else, where Peter takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him. Right? And so Peter is then, in turn, rebuked by Jesus. And that word rebuked is the same word that's used to cast out a demon. This is now more like Peter. It's like, get away from me, Satan. Right? That's what he says. Get behind me, Satan. If you're not setting your mind on things of God, but on the things of man. So why were the demons silenced? In part, because their proclamation was true, but it did not recognize, just hearing that word of glory was not enough when he'd hear the word of sacrifice and suffering. Right? This confession is not enough and shouldn't be proclaimed unless it's connected to the cross. When it's just a theology of glory, it's not really Christ. Sometimes churches can do that. Often TV evangelists and individuals like that will do that. It's all about glory, right? It's all about, hey, you pray and you get what you want, and that includes a really nice limousine and a boat, a yacht out the back and all that kind of stuff. That's not consistent here, right? That's not consistent with the teaching of Jesus. Jesus, in fact, says, if you want to follow me, you have to deny yourself, take up your cross. So, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Very differently directed. Now, what's interesting about that is that in these next 3 chapters, really in portions of 8, 9, and 10, not even the whole of these chapters, we began midway through 8, we have questions of 3 times. This thing that we just saw, we read that passage prediction, the disciples misunderstand, and Jesus teaches about discipleship. Turn to 9:30. You can kind of see it in there, in my outline, but 9:30, it's in the black bold print. This is kind of an untraditional outline, but it has to be untraditional because it's kind of a structure that isn't, capital 1 and then ABC, 2 ABC. It's different. So anyway, you have another passion. In verse 30, right, he says, the Son of Man is going to be delivered in the hands of men, and they will kill him. And after 3 days he will rise. That's verse 30 through 32. In verse 33 through 37, what happens? Well, the disciples Jesus is saying this about he's going to be killed, right? What are the disciples talking about? They're arguing along the way who was the greatest. They're not getting it. They're like, Jesus being killed? What does that mean? They're arguing about who's the greatest. So he sits down in verse 35, and he says to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he takes a child and uses the child as an example, right? So, same thing. This is what I'm really being called to. Disciples aren't getting it. They're thinking worldly success, they're thinking power, they're thinking authority, they're thinking who's great. Jesus gives them a teaching on discipleship. And then you can turn again to 10:32. And they were going on the road, going up to Jerusalem. They were on the road. They're on the way, right, to Jerusalem. We know where that's heading, right? Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed. As those who followed were afraid, and taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, see, we are going to Jerusalem. I mean, he's very specific here. And the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes. They will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up and said, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant us to sit, one at your right and one at your left in your glory. Are they getting it? No. Hey, who's going to be at his right, his left? In Jesus' hour of glory. 2 thieves hanging on the cross. Because that's really his hour of glory. Now that's more a Johannine conversation. Talks about the hour of his glory, but that still is true. It's just not the imagery that Mark picks up as strongly. But he talks to them about that a little bit. And then in verse 32, he kind of says, well, we don't want to go into detail. Let's move to 42. He speaks to them directly about it, but then in verse 30, he calls them to him and says to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles, in other words, in the world, Gentiles, people of the world, lord it over them, and the great ones exercise authority over them. That's the way it works. I understand. If you're saying Messiah, anointed one, king, this is your image, right? Lording over. I'm in charge. You listen. Jump, and you jump. How high? But, he says, it shall not be so among you. Right? Can I sit you to right and left? That's not what this position is all about. Right? It shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many. So 3 times we have this teaching of Jesus going to the cross. We don't get it. Jesus says, this is what I'm calling you to be, a life of service, a life that's willing to sacrifice, right? What's in the midst of this? Well, in the middle of those 2 passion predictions, in the first 2, is the transfiguration of Jesus, which, by the way, even has like a little mini passion prediction in it, but is this transfiguration of Jesus in an exorcism, which I think you can move to some symbolic suggestions as well. And then between passion 2 and 3 is a bunch of teachings about discipleship. There's about sin, about being salty followers, about marriage, about children, about riches, giving your whole life. All of this stuff is in there. So these teachings about the demands of discipleship. And what's on the 2 side of this? This is the part I love about this section so much. And on both sides, which you would never get on a Sunday, right? Because we just read this text, or even in your devotions. But when you see the whole of it, you realize, when you see this very deliberate section on discipleship, very much talking about how we're to give our life and serve, 3 times, with teaching discipleship in between, what brackets this entire section? 2 blind people who are healed. The point being, we need to see this. If you're going to see who Jesus is, you need to see this. So that begins in 8, 22 through 26. Jesus comes to Bethsaida, and some people brought him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, led him out of the village, and when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Oh, what in the world? Wasn't Jesus' spit good enough the first time? Right? I mean, when did we see Jesus kind of, heal someone and like they got up on one leg? No, wait, the other one's still lame. Right? Can you touch me again? Right? Someone else came and just touched his cloak and they're healed. Right? This one, I see, but I don't see clearly. Then Jesus lands his eyes on his eyes again. He opened his eyes, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him home. The disciples, this is illustrative. This miracle is illustrative of the fact that we're starting to see, but we don't see it all. Let Jesus touch you. Let Jesus see you. You see Jesus. Right? Continue to abide under his word and under his care and under his instruction. You might see the whole of who he is. And then at the end, there's another individual, Bartimaeus, chapter 10, verse 46, who then sees, right? Whose sight is recovered more completely. Son of David, have mercy on me, which is, of course, a messianic call. But this one is healed and is able to be restored to fullness of sight. So, hopefully, maybe we weren't seeing very clearly at the beginning, but after hearing multiple times, and I'm sure Jesus had to tell the disciples more than 3 times, but after hearing 3 times, we've begun to see. Make sense? As soon as Bartimaeus is healed, guess where we are? Chapter 11, triumphal entry. Okay? And from there, of course, we move through the events of Jesus' last week. From the withering of the fig tree to the teachings and debates, really, the arguments that he has with the leaders of the temple, within the temple. He kind of goes in the temple 3 times. He enters the temple, looks around. He enters the temple around which the fig tree is cursed, which is symbolic, of course, and then he enters the temple around which then he has these conversations and arguments really with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. It ends with the widow's offering, who gave, remember the widow's offering, who put the little coin, right? Everyone else gives out of their plenty. Well, what does she give? What was Jesus saying? You have to give whoever's first is last, right? This whole teaching of discipleship, give of yourself, give up your life. What does the widow give? She gives up the last coin. She gave more than anyone else. She gave her whole life. The word isn't she gave her last 2 pennies. It's her whole life. Right? So we have that example. We then have chapter 13, which is kind of this mini apocalypse, kind of end time conversation. And then the passage begins in 14 and continues through 14 into 15. Now, I'd like to just, I know we're kind of going through that quickly and shouldn't. It's the point of the whole of it, although really, as you could see, the whole point of Mark is leading up to this, right? From very early, where opposition is already beginning there at the end of, the beginning of the 2nd chapter, right? Opposition is beginning by the 3rd. They're seeking out to destroy him. This center section that makes clear this is where he's going. He's telling us that this is critical to understand about Messiahship. And then we have the actual crucifixion. Well, that happens in chapter 15. So I just want to read that for you from Mark. When the 6th hour, I'm reading beginning at verse 33. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, Behold, he is calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. And Jesus uttered in a loud cry and breathed his last. And the centurion of the temple, I'm sorry. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that it was in this way he breathed his last, he said, Truly this man was the Son of God. Now, why did I just want to end with that? It is interesting to note that the demon said he was the Son of God. The author said Jesus was the Son of God. The first verse he said. But nobody else, including even Peter, has said he was Son of God. Now, if we go to one of the other Gospels, we would see where Peter confesses who Jesus is, and he says, You're the Messiah, the Son of God. Mark doesn't have that in Peter's confession. Mark, and he also doesn't have a lot of other things Jesus said, right? This isn't everything Jesus said or everything everyone else said. He just doesn't have that in there. He refrains from anyone recognizing or being able to speak that he is the Son of God until what? He dies on the cross. And if everyone to say it, it's a centurion, a foreigner, the last person you would expect. But one's confession that Jesus is the Son of God is incomplete unless one sees that he's the one that was on the cross. That being Messiah, that being the anointed one, means the suffering servant that we read about in Isaiah, who was the last prophet that we looked at. Right? So, in the silence, that's always a question, like, why the messianic secret? Why wouldn't Jesus say, hey, all right, go tell everyone. Did you guys hear what that demon said? He knows who I am. Right? You should know who I am. Peter. You got it right, Peter, but quiet. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone that. Why? Because it's an incomplete confession without the cross. It's only complete here at the end. One other little piece I want to read for you. Maybe I mentioned this last time. I almost skipped it, even though we're just a few minutes after. But we'll end right after this. So when Peter is arrested in verse 43, We'll go back to chapter 14. I mean, I mentioned this when we did our review, the first session on the Gospels. I don't know. In verse 43, immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, Jesus is speaking, one of the 12, with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, scribes, and elders. This is when Jesus was betrayed. The betrayer had given them a sign. The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard. And when he came, he went up to the once and said, Rabbi, and he kissed him. He laid hands on him and seized him. One of those who stood by drew a sword. We have that whole piece. And then in verse 50, and all of them left him and fled. And then in verse 51 and 52, I think I did read this to you, and a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him. But he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Right? Some of you are nodding your head. So we can't know, why is this in there? Why is there this little comment about a young man who had been following him, who had a linen cloth around his body, just kind of a little tunicky, or maybe even diaperish type of cloth, around him, was seized as all these soldiers and stuff were grabbing people. Everyone's running away, and he ran right out of his breeches, right? Ran away naked. What's this about? My romantic guess is that is the author of the Gospel of Mark. We know that he ended up being, tradition tells us he ended up being with Peter, that Peter kind of apprenticed him, that in fact, documents from around 1200 said that, not 12, 120, 1200 would be 1,200, wouldn't it be? 120 said that it was an apprentice of Peter that wrote John Mark. And I think he may well have been there at this time, kind of following, young person. Peter then took him on his wing in the beginning of church. That's not much time, right? He'd have to be that old to then be with Peter and be old enough to be writing and stuff. So he was a young man and he saw this. The other thing I think is interesting about Mark is that when you read it, and we could have looked at this in Peter, but what we see in Mark most starkly is the utter failure of the disciples. Of every one of the Gospels, the disciples are depicted the worst. When Jesus, remember we told the story and I read purposely what he said to them. He says, "And you of no faith." In Matthew it says little faith, right? It's no faith. I think as Peter was giving these words, I can imagine as Peter's giving these words, he would have felt great conviction at his own failures of how he followed, right? And it was not about glorifying Peter. He wasn't going to tell the story in a way to say, hey, and I, Peter, I knew what, I was right there, right? But he would have been the first one to say, I said, Jesus, you're the Son of God. And then he started talking about going to the cross, and I told him, no way, Jesus, you can't do this. And he rebuked me. He said, get behind me, Satan. Nothing has ever been said to me that hurt me as much as hearing that. Until I heard the rooster crow. You can see Peter in this telling. And you can see this young man, potentially, as then the one who would have written it. In the same way, everyone forsook him and fled. This one kid ran away naked. I think this is his Hitchcock moment. Or in more modern terms, Stan Lee moment. In the Marvel movies when he was alive, he always had a little cameo. But I think this is a historic cameo for him. Maybe not. Maybe it's just there. Maybe it has other symbolic meaning, some, baptismally naked or something. But I think that's at least romantically kind of a, something. Okay? Thank you all very much. We're a couple minutes after. Hopefully, though that is helpful, and this outline, it is a strange outline, but I kind of set pieces off out of bold print or italic print so you could see kind of parallels and just kind of the groupings of the sections and how the whole of it really moves us to proclaim something. And I think it's really unique in that way in terms of the Gospels and in terms of Scripture at all. So, thank you.